Jonathan Levy, it's great to have you with me. The book is called Ages of American Capitalism. There's a good portion of my audience, Jonathan, that doesn't know a time in America where the Federal Reserve was not a constant part of even a generalist's conversation about what was happening in the U.S. economy. It wasn't always so. Explain to my audience when that got started.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Major. I think that got started in the early 1980s. The kind of modern era in which the central bank, the Federal Reserve, plays such an important role in shaping the American economy, began in 1979 when a new chairman of the Federal Reserve was appointed by Jimmy Carter, Paul Volcker. At the time, there was very high inflation in the United States. The value of the dollar had plummeted, and Volcker raised interest rates, both to tamp down inflation and to restore the value of the dollar. That induced a strong recession, a lot of unemployment. It lasted until 1982. It coincided with the reduction of inflation. At that point, Volcker relented and reduced interest rates, and a new expansion began across the 1980s. And really, ever since then, the Federal Reserve has been the most important, I think, government institution with respect to the regulation of and the driving of and the shaping of capitalism in the United States.
And how did that capitalism change in that era that you describe as the age of chaos?
Well, I call the age of chaos one that began in 1982. The age before it, I call the age of control. That's a post-war period, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's an era that was still, to a large degree, dominated by an industrial economy. Deindustrialization had already begun in the 1960s and 1970s, but industry was still, in many respects, the backbone of the American economy. From the 1980s forward, ever since then, finance and services become much more important to the American economy, which is precisely why the Fed, in charge of monetary policy, plays such a prominent role, has played and continues to play such a prominent role in the United States economy.
There's a sentence that jumps out in your discussing this age of chaos: a capitalism dominated by asset price appreciation. For the generalist in my audience, help them understand what that means and why it's so important.
Okay, I think in the era before, when you have an industrial economy, you grow the economy by using capital. Think of a factory. You use it up, and as you use that factory, you combine it with labor to produce goods. The value of the capital depreciates, right? If you're using a factory, you start in January and you run the factory, by the end of the year, it's worth less, but you've produced goods in combination with labor. In a financialized economy, capital appreciates. So think about a stock, right? Or a bond, right? You want the price or the value of capital to go up. But in order to do that, what you need is debt, right? The more debt you have, the more you can juice financial profits. But you don't need a lot of labor, right, to create value that way. And so you end up with an economy that increases inequality, but not just inequality, it really excludes a lot of people from valuation in the economy. That way that's taken place largely in the United States over the last 40 years has been geographical disparities. And so in regions of the country, they're rather obvious, we could say them, places like New York, places like Silicon Valley see a lot of asset price appreciation, both in financial instruments, but also in homes. Homes is another asset, real estate, but it does so in a way that largely excludes labor from earning a share of the value created.
And that exclusion of labor creates frustration. And if I'm listening to you correctly and reading your book correctly, part or a large part of the political frustration in our American experience now can be traced to this age of chaos and things that have either silently or unobservedly flowed through to create this separation economically and the underlying frustration.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, it creates frustration in politics, but it also creates social pathologies, isolation, destruction of communities that then feeds into politics in insidious ways. And it's been a slow build. It's been a slow boil over the last 40 years. But I think it's fair to say here, I think 2008 would be a crucial kind of marker. Um, but in many respects, the kind of inequities and exclusions of that capitalism that we've lived with for the last 40 years is not exclusively responsible, but I think to a large degree, as you say, is very much responsible for political frustrations in the United States today.
And the reason I wanted to drill down on that, Jonathan, is because it is often shorthanded in our political conversation now. Well, free trade did all this, and free trade is the reason. But no, free trade maybe accelerated these trends, but they were already existent before NAFTA, China was brought into the World Trade Organization, and the like.
I think that's right. This gets into some pretty technical,
Yes.
complicated issues. But nonetheless, there's a huge debate about whether the structure of the global economy is more so determined by trade patterns or determined by financial patterns, right? By how capital moves around the world. And one of the changes that Volcker brought to the economy unintentionally, it wasn't like he was trying to do it, was to make U.S. financial assets, mostly U.S. public debt, so we think about treasuries, a kind of magnet for global capital, which increases the value of the dollar because people around the world want to hold dollars. When you do that, that makes U.S. manufacturers and U.S. goods less competitive, and it makes it easier for the United States, the U.S. consumer, to import goods. And so that kind of financialization is very much tied to the U.S. consumer market playing such an important role for the global economy, which has shaped trade patterns the last 40 years. And so far, the Trump administration has tried to address the issue through trade, right, through tariffs. But I think it's picked up the wrong end of the stick. If you actually want to change the structure of the American economy and the global economy, you really have to get at capital. And in the economy today, that means getting at how finance works.
So, from your vantage point, Jonathan, tariffs are not going to reindustrialize. They're not going to reshore, or if they do, they will only at the margins, unless you deal with this underlying question of a capitalism driven by asset appreciation.
That's correct. I want to be careful. I'm glad you brought that up because I want to be careful. I think one of the problems we have in our politics today is not just frustration, but it's nostalgia, right, for the kind of post-war period, for a manufacturing economy. And, the industrial economy is not coming back, and I don't think we would want it to come back. Clearly through trade policy, probably better through other kinds of policies like just direct subsidies, things like that, you could restore the U.S. manufacturing base. What's different about manufacturing today versus 50 years ago, it just doesn't employ the same amount of people. And so even if you were to do that, if it were to be successful, it's not going to play the role in the economy that it once did, especially in relationship to employment. There the question has to do with the services, and the services, the kind of high income financial and business services, combined with kind of low income services, things like retail, food preparation, healthcare. That really explains the structure of the economy in terms of people's jobs and everyday lives. And no, to your point, I agree. I don't think you're going to change that structure through trade policy. Definitely not through trade policy alone, and probably not through trade policy, very much at all.
Your book is an examination of America through a distinctly economic lens, the entire sweep of American history. So this is probably a tough question for you to answer, but how do you think about artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and other things that are beginning to, it feels, revolutionize our current understanding of the economy?
Well, I'm a historian, and historians have a bias. We think there's nothing new under the sun. With that said, I'll happily wear my historian's hat. I think if you look at AI, it sounds to me, or it feels to me, a lot like what happened in the late 1990s. A lot of hype, a lot of big spending by corporations on kind of new fixed capital, the kind of infrastructure then of information technology, now of AI. Huge stock market valuations that were untethered from the kind of underlying profits of the business. And then a lot of talk about how these new technologies would increase productivity, transform the world of work, but really no evidence in the statistics, that it's done so. There's been some reports the last few weeks that 95% of firms, this is an MIT study, that have turned to AI have yet to find ways to actually use AI that increases productivity or efficiency in their companies. So it feels old to me, but nonetheless, if you take the 1990s as a kind of example, certainly the internet has transformed, the way we live, the way we work, and I think that'll be the case with AI too. But transformations at the scale of, say, the Industrial Revolution, or the transition from, hunting and gathering to settled agriculture, those kinds of comparisons, are not ones that I find particularly persuasive. But I could be wrong.
What about robotics? I've read retail analysts talk about massive firms like Walmart, Amazon, possibly Target if it gets back in the game, increasing profits over the next 5 years with a completely static employment base, meaning they don't have to hire anyone else to do things more efficiently, build out warehousing, deliver products to consumers more rapidly at a sustained price point, meaning more profits, but they don't need to hire anyone else.
That's true, but that's been true for decades now.
Okay.
So I think that technologies are important, but what matters is the context in which they're adopted. And so the profit share versus the labor share has been going up for the last few years. It's been it went up, since 2020. It rocketed up in the context of the pandemic. So I think the question is, what are the policies, what are the politics in which these technologies are adopted? There's fears that a lot of these technologies will be labor shedding, and I think many of them will be. But if that's the case, governments can decide how that process unfolds. They can decide what kinds of new jobs are created on what terms when old jobs go away. So, I don't think we should see technology as a kind of autonomous, automatic force in and of itself, right? I think we have to think about the context to which these technologies, unfold in the economy.
How about the speed and believability of transactions? Because that's where cryptocurrency comes in. And that does feel to me like a potentially revolutionary innovation, especially if central banks begin to recognize
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, this takes us back to the Fed, right? I do think we're living at a moment of just tremendous transformation in the institution of money. When Bitcoin, first was announced, there was an anonymous kind of manifesto that really talked about the need to create new, right, digital means of exchange, right? Money should be a means of exchange. It's what we use to buy and sell goods and services. Instead, crypto's become something else. It's become another speculative asset that's part of that game of asset price appreciation that we talked about. But I think crypto could be a positive new technology for the reasons you suggest, as a new means of transaction, a new means of exchange that could include more people within the realm of the financial system, give them more control over it, more participation in it, but it would have to be regulated. And there we come back to a kind of fundamental question of how the Federal Reserve and also other regulators within the federal government, how they're going to manage and regulate crypto, or not. The Biden administration had rolled out some regulations there, but not much, and then Trump's undone them. It has, very much wanted to kind of include crypto within a kind of broader economy of asset price appreciation.
Jonathan, you mentioned a moment ago a collective nostalgia we have in America for that post-World War II economic boom. You know better than I do, but I know, even as a generalist, that was a complete anomaly in the history economically of our country. There's never been anything like it before or since, and therefore, structurally, our nostalgia is misplaced.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, you can talk about policies, you can get into the nitty-gritty, and one should. But I think one of the biggest problems we have in our politics today is a kind of inability to imagine our collective future, right? Including the future of the economy, an economy that would be more productive, would grow more, but would also be more inclusive and more just. And we're kind of stuck, right? We're kind of stuck in that politics of nostalgia. And I agree with you, the post-war world is not coming back, nor should we want it to. And yet, nonetheless, whether it's kind of Democrats or towards the left, talking about the next New Deal, right, or a Green New Deal, or reviving a New Deal, or towards the right, towards Trump, make America great again. These are all backward-looking visions. And capitalism works best as an economic system when it creates new futures. And part of the problem with asset price appreciation is it doesn't do that. It's speculation. It's capital spinning its top. It doesn't actually build or create something, new, including an economy that's, worth living in.
The book is Ages of American Capitalism, and as I mentioned, it is a history of our whole country. To synthesize it for my audience, what would you say are the most important takeaways of our American experience with our economic experimentation?
Well, first, to the last point we were just discussing, one of the reasons why the United States has been a quintessentially capitalist nation is because it's a country, because of its democratic traditions, because of other traditions, that's always been committed towards an open future and the creativity that's sort of bound up with believing in an open future. So that's one takeaway, and I think one dimension of our current political economy that it'd be nice if we could recover in our politics and our economics. The second would be how the state relates to the economy. We have I think largely a myth in our politics that the private and the public have always been separated. There's always been a strong kind of line separating them. When the truth is, in different ways, that line has blurred. And the question is, how does that line blur, and does it create dynamism, or not? And, the book's called Ages of American Capitalism. There's 4 different ages. What creates a new age in every instance has to do with a kind of movement by the state to recreate and reimagine the economy. That happened with the founding of the United States, or prior to that, with the British Empire's creation of North America. It happened after the Civil War with the abolition of slavery. It happened in the New Deal. It happened again in the 1980s. We're talking about that crucial moment with the Volcker shock. And I think that, after the book came out, a lot of people have asked me, are we living in a transition to a new age of capitalism? I think we are. I think we are living in a moment of really important transformation and change. But the question is going to be, how is the state going to push capitalism forward or realign it? And what will the politics of that be? And I think that's what we're very much waiting to see what will happen next.
Anything you would want to impart to my audience about what to watch for as to how that is going to be either properly shapen or misshapen, that is to say, the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a real continuity, across the first Trump administration through Biden and now Trump again, is that when the state has been most active, it's happened in the context of national security politics, mostly vis-a-vis the United States relationship with China. There's a long history of that, a history of wartime, especially World War II, being very generative in reshaping capitalism, but also the appeals to national security in shaping the economy. And that's an important site to look at, but nonetheless, there's limits to that. And I think if there can't be a kind of broader political context outside of just national security and war, I think it's very unlikely we're going to get the kind of economic changes that would respond to the political frustrations you were addressing earlier, respond to them in a positive and a productive way moving forward.
Ages of American Capitalism came out in 2021, which means it's not a new book. It's just new to me, but it is brilliant, comprehensive, and accessible. Jonathan Levy, I appreciate the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.